It was April of 1971 when Alice Brennan, all of 24 years old and with a quietness about her that most people mistook for fragility, walked into the Green Mountain County Records office to do something foolish. She was there to sign the deed for 96 acres of rock and regret that climbed the western face of Widow's Peak. The land had no proper name, only a designation on a county map and a reputation as a place where good intentions went to die. It was a vertical boneyard of granite and shale, a landscape of sharp angles and thin soil where the wind never seemed to rest. Let me tell you about that office. It smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco that clung to the wood-paneled walls like a ghost. The county clerk was a man named Henderson, a man whose body had settled into the shape of his chair over 30 years of service. He peered at Alice over his spectacles, his expression a practiced blend of civic duty and gentle pity. He had known her father, Thomas Brennan, a man who had spent more time observing the world than participating in it, and in his eyes, the daughter was simply continuing a family tradition of impracticality. "Now, Alice," he began, his voice softened by a lifetime of delivering minor bad news. "You're sure about this? The county formally decommissioned this parcel from agricultural consideration back in '58. Arthur Finch himself wrote the report. Said you couldn't grow rocks on it any more than it already does." Arthur Finch was the head of the Regional Agricultural Board, a man whose pronouncements carried the weight of scripture in these parts. If Finch said land was useless, then it was useless. It was a fact, like the sun rising in the east or the bitterness of a January morning. To question it was to question the natural order of things. Alice simply nodded, her hands resting on the worn strap of her satchel. "I'm sure, Mr. Henderson." He sighed, a slow deflation of responsibility. "Well, the money is right and the paperwork is in order. It's your decision, young lady. Your father, he was a good man. A dreamer, but a good man. I suppose he'd be proud you're buying a piece of Vermont, no matter the piece." The condescension was as thick and smooth as cream, meant to soothe but succeeding only in coating everything with a film of dismissal. He saw a girl playing homesteader, a folly to be indulged before she came to her senses and married a sensible boy with a proper dairy farm down in the valley. He was not alone. The news of the purchase traveled through the hollows and villages with the speed of gossip. The men at the feed store chuckled into their coffee. "That Brennan girl bought the Widow's Peak plot," one would say. 96 acres of nothing. Another would add, "Heard she paid cash. All that money from her father's passing. A shame." The neighboring farmers, men who worked land that was flat, fertile, and forgiving, would look up at the jagged silhouette of her property against the sky and shake their heads. They saw it as an act of profound ignorance, a city dweller's fantasy about country living that was about to collide with the granite-hard reality of their world. They treated the sale not as a transaction, but as a tragedy in slow motion. Now, let me explain something about conventional wisdom. It is a comfortable blanket woven from the threads of shared experience. It keeps a community warm and safe, protecting it from the cold winds of uncertainty. But sometimes, that blanket is so thick, it smothers any new light. The conventional wisdom in Green Mountain County in 1971 was this: cows need flat pasture, corn needs deep soil, and a farm's worth is measured in its predictable annual yield of milk and silage. The rocky hillside Alice had bought fit nowhere in that equation. It was an anomaly, a variable that could only equal zero. What they did not know, what none of them could possibly comprehend, was that Alice Brennan was not a dreamer. She was an heiress. But her inheritance was not the modest sum of money her father had left her. It was a legacy of knowledge, bound in worn leather and filled with the elegant, patient script of a man who had understood the world by watching it. Her father, Thomas Brennan, had been a land surveyor by trade, but an observer by nature. For the last 10 years of his life, a sickness in his lungs had kept him from the strenuous work of the field, so he had turned his meticulous attention to the world outside his window. And his window looked directly out upon those 96 acres of useless land. For a decade, he had sat with a pair of binoculars, a weather station, and a stack of journals, and he had studied that hillside as if it were a sacred text. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever truly looked at a piece of land? I don't mean glanced at it or judged it for its utility. I mean looked. Have you watched where the snow melts first in March? Have you noted which plants thrive in the thin soil between the rocks after a dry spell? Have you observed the way the wind, channeled by the valley, carries the scent of pine and wild thyme up the slopes? Thomas Brennan had, and he had written it all down. Alice possessed that journal. It was her most precious artifact. The cover was soft as a glove, the pages filled with his neat, angular handwriting, punctuated by detailed sketches of leaves, rock formations, and animal tracks. It was not a diary of feelings, but a logbook of facts. The 14th of May, 1965, one entry read, "Heavy rain last night. The valley farms will be waterlogged for a week, but the hillside drains perfectly. The water runs in sheets over the granite faces, then finds the deep fissures. The soil, what little there is damp but not flooded. The land breathes." The 2nd of August 1967, read another. Drought continues. The pastures in the valley are brown and cracked, but on the slope, the wild vetch, chicory, and Queen Anne's lace are thriving. Their roots are deep, pulling minerals and moisture from between the stones. This is not cow pasture. This is a fortress of forage. Then, in 1969, came the entry that formed the core of Alice's entire endeavor. Her father had been reading a book on Old World agriculture, and a spark had ignited. The 20th of September, 1969. Reading about the alpine goats of France and Switzerland. They live on terrain just like this, steeper even. The locals say the milk from these goats is intensely flavored by the terroir, the wild herbs, the mineral-rich water that filters through the rock. The cheese they make is not a commodity, it is an expression of the land itself. I look at our hillside. I see the same plants. I feel the same clean, sharp air. The world sees a wasteland. I believe they are looking for the wrong animal. He was right. The men gathered at the feed store, the clerk in his comfortable chair, the agricultural expert with his official reports. They were all looking for a place to put a cow. They saw the land through the lens of their own experience, and so they could only see what was missing. They couldn't see what was there. Alice, guided by her father's patient eyes, saw something different. She saw a vertical garden, a perfect home for an animal as rugged and resilient as the land itself. So she began. The money her father left was just enough. It paid for the land, for the materials to repair the dilapidated one-room cabin that stood on a small, level patch near the road, and for the first dozen goats. She didn't buy prize-winning stock. She drove to 3 different farms and bought the animals nobody else wanted, the runts, the ones with crooked horns, the ones deemed too scraggly or stubborn for a proper dairy. She knew from her father's notes that she didn't need pampered animals. She needed survivors. She needed goats with the grit to forage, to climb, to make a living from stone and scrub. The first 2 years were a master class in solitary labor. She learned the language of the land not from a book, but through the ache in her back and the calluses on her hands. She spent the first summer fencing, not the neat, straight fences of the valley farms, but meandering lines of wire and cedar posts that followed the contours of the land. She had to drill into rock for some of the post holes, a slow, jarring process that sent vibrations up her arms and into her teeth. The neighbors would watch her from their trucks as they passed on the road below, a tiny figure wrestling with post-hole diggers and wire stretchers on a 40-degree slope. It confirmed everything they believed. She was not just foolish, she was possessed by a special kind of madness. The whispers continued. That Brennan girl is still up there. Saw her hauling water in buckets. Her well must have run dry. Heard she lost a goat to a coyote. They weren't entirely wrong. The well did run low in the dry heat of that first August. She did lose a young goat one moonless night. There were moments of profound, crushing doubt. Let me tell you about one such moment. It was the middle of her second winter. A nor'easter had buried her cabin in 3 feet of snow, and the wind howled down the chimney like a hungry wolf. For 3 days, she was completely isolated. One of her best milkers, a tough old goat she called Agate, had come down with a fever. Alice sat with the animal in the small, clean barn she had built, the air thick with the smell of hay and sick goat, her lantern casting long, dancing shadows. She was exhausted. Her fingers were numb with cold. The goat's breathing was shallow, and for a terrifying moment, Alice felt the entire weight of her gambles settle upon her. The voices of the valley echoed in her head. A fool's errand. A waste of good money. She'll be gone by spring. In that cold, dark barn, she believed them. She thought of her father, and for the first time, a bitter thought surfaced. Maybe he was just a dreamer. Maybe his journal was just the poetic rambling of a sick man who saw what he wanted to see. She felt a tear freeze on her cheek. She was alone, and she was failing. But then, Agate shifted, letting out a low bleat, and nudged Alice's hand. It was a simple, animal gesture, a request for comfort. And in that moment, something shifted in Alice. She looked at the goat, at her thick, wiry coat, and her intelligent, stubborn eyes. This animal was a creature of the rocks, a survivor. And so was she. She stood up, her resolve hardening like ice. She went back to the cabin, stoked the fire, and pulled out her father's journal. She didn't read the poetic parts. She read the practical entries, the notes on herbal remedies. June 4th. Yarrow grows thick near the eastern ridge. A natural febrifuge. The deer know it. The next morning, the storm had broken. Alice put on snowshoes and spent 2 grueling hours trekking to the eastern ridge, her father's sketch of the yarrow plant seared into her mind. She found the dried stalks poking through the snow, exactly where he said they would be. She gathered them, brewed a potent tea, and carefully administered it to the sick goat. For 2 days it was touch and go. Then, on the 3rd morning, Alice entered the barn to find Agate standing, chewing her cud, her fever gone. That was a turning point. She had not relied on the feed store or the vet down in the valley. She had relied on the land and on the knowledge her father had bequeathed her. The land had provided a cure. It had affirmed her path. She was not a fool. She was a student, and the hillside was her teacher. From that day forward, her work took on a new intensity. The subsequent 5 years were a quiet, unobserved revolution. She learned the craft of cheesemaking through relentless trial and error. Her small cabin became a laboratory. She built a cheese cave, digging it back into the hillside where the temperature remained a constant, cool 55 degrees. She learned the subtle alchemy of cultures and rennet, of salting and aging. At first, the results were discouraging. The cheese was too sour, or too crumbly, or it developed a bitter rind. But she was as patient as her father had been. She kept a journal just like his, not of the land, but of the milk. She noted the subtle changes in its flavor as the seasons turned. In the spring, when the goats feasted on tender new shoots, the milk was light and grassy. In the late summer, when they foraged on the tough, mineral-rich herbs her father had documented, the milk grew thick and complex, with a nutty, almost spicy undertone. The The land was beginning to speak through the milk, and Alice was finally learning to translate. Then, in the autumn of her 7th year on the property, she got it right. She had been aging a small batch of pressed, hard cheeses for 6 months. When she cut into the first wheel, the aroma that filled the small cave was astonishing. It smelled of the hillside itself, of wild thyme, damp stone, and sweet clover. She sliced a thin piece and placed it on her tongue. The flavor was a revelation. It was sharp at first, then creamy, with a long, complex finish that was unlike any cheese she had ever tasted. It was the taste of rock and sun and stubborn life. It was the taste of her victory. She started small, selling a few wheels at a time from a card table at the end of her driveway. Most of her customers were tourists on their way to see the fall foliage, people from away who didn't know the land was supposed to be useless. They were captivated by the story, by the intense, unique flavor of the cheese. She called it Widow's Peak, turning the local superstition into a brand. The loudest skeptic, of course, remained Arthur Finch. He had occasion to drive past her property on his way to inspect the real farms in the area. He would see her small sign and the occasional car pulled over and would scoff. At a county board meeting, he once used her as a punchline. "We have dairy farms in this county producing 10,000 pounds of milk a day," he'd said, to knowing chuckles. "And we have other enterprises, boutique projects. A nice hobby, I'm sure." He never used her name. He didn't have to. The vindication, when it came, did not arrive with a thunderclap, but with the quiet hum of a rented sedan with a flat tire. It was a crisp October afternoon, nearly a decade after Alice had bought the land. A man in city clothes, looking profoundly out of place, walked up her long driveway. His name was Jonathan Pierce, and he was a food writer for a major New York magazine. His rental had blown a tire right at the bottom of her road. While waiting for a tow truck, he had wandered up, drawn by her simple, hand-painted sign. Alice, now in her mid-30s, her face weathered by the sun and wind, her hands strong and capable, greeted him with her usual quiet courtesy. She offered him a glass of water and, as was her habit with any visitor, a slice of her cheese. "Now, let me paint you this picture. A man who spends his life tasting the finest foods in the world, sitting on a rough-hewn bench outside a tiny cabin, looking out at a herd of scruffy goats grazing on a rocky hillside. He takes a bite of the cheese, expecting very little. His eyes, which had been glazed with the boredom of a man stranded in the middle of nowhere, suddenly sharpen. He takes another, slower bite. He closes his eyes. 'What is this?' he asked, his voice a near whisper. 'It's cheese,' Alice said simply. 'No,' he replied, looking at her with an expression of awe. 'This is not just cheese. This is a place. I can taste the rocks. I can taste herbs. I have never tasted anything like it.' He spent the next 2 hours with her. The tow truck came and went. He was not interested in his car anymore. He was interested in her. He saw the journal. He saw the cheese cave. He understood. He did not see a hobbyist. He saw a master. 2 months later, the article came out. It was a 2-page spread with a full-color photo of Alice, standing on her hillside, her goats arrayed around her like a royal court. The headline was simple: "The Taste of a Mountain." Pierce did not just praise the cheese. He told the whole story. The useless land, the father's journal, the stubborn goats, the solitary woman who had listened to the land when no one else would. The effect was immediate and seismic. The phone in Alice's cabin, which had rarely rung for 10 years, began ringing off the hook. It was chefs from Boston. It was fromagers from Philadelphia. It was specialty food distributors in New York City who wanted to buy her entire year's production, sight unseen. They didn't ask the price. They just wanted to know if they could get it. The land that the county had formerly declared worthless was now, acre for acre, the most profitable piece of agricultural land in the entire region. Her small herd of unwanted goats was producing a product more valuable than the milk from 1,000 pampered cows. The change in the valley was palpable. The chuckles at the feed store died out, replaced by murmurs of grudging respect. The neighbors who had shaken their heads in pity now looked up at the hillside with a new kind of wonder. They had been wrong. It was a simple, undeniable fact, as solid as the granite under their feet. Alice Brennan was not a fool. She was a visionary. Which brings me to the end, to the acknowledgement. It was about a year after the article appeared. Alice was inspecting her fences along the lower edge of the property when a polished county vehicle pulled onto the shoulder of the road. Arthur Finch got out. He was older now, his certainty softened by age and, perhaps, by a dawning sense of humility. He didn't stride up the hill. He walked slowly, deliberately, like a man approaching a shrine. He stopped about 10 feet from her, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked past her, up at the thriving, vibrant hillside, at the goats moving gracefully among the rocks. He took in the solid barn, the neat cabin with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. He saw not an enterprise, but an ecosystem, a success. Alice, he said. The use of her first name, without the diminutive young lady attached, was an admission in itself. She simply nodded, waiting. She held no grudge. There was no need. The land itself was her vindication. He cleared his throat. I wrote the report on this land. Back in '58. I walked it for 2 days. I declared it without value. He looked down at his polished shoes, which seemed absurdly out of place on the rugged ground. I was a young man then. I knew everything there was to know about farming. He looked back up at her, and his eyes were clear. I was wrong. It was a quiet confession, offered not in a boardroom, but on the very land he had condemned. How? He finally asked, the question that had been echoing through the whole county. How did you know? Alice looked up at the slope, at the play of light and shadow on the rocks, a view she knew as well as her own face. I didn't know, she said, her voice even and calm. But my father did. He taught me how to look. The land tells you what it needs, if you're quiet enough to listen. Finch stood there for a long moment, the wind rustling the dry autumn leaves around them. He finally extended his hand. Your father would be very proud, he said. And this time, there was no pity in his voice, only a deep and profound respect. Alice shook his hand. It was firm, the grip of a man who had finally learned that some knowledge isn't found in official reports. The story, of course, does not end there. Alice Brennan never got big. She never expanded beyond what the 96 acres could sustainably support. Her victory was not in conquering the land, but in entering into a partnership with it. The cheese became legendary, but it always remained rare, a taste of a specific place, made by a specific person. Years later, an old woman now with lines of laughter and wisdom etched around her eyes, she would sit on her porch with her granddaughter. She'd point to the hillside. You see that patch of blue flowers over there, by that big rock? She'd ask. That's chicory. The goats love it in August. It makes the milk taste like hazelnuts. And one day, she brought out the old leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the knowledge was timeless. She placed it in her granddaughter's hands. The legacy was not the farm, not the fame, not the money. It was the journal. It was the quiet act of looking. It was the understanding that a place is never useless. It is only ever waiting for the right person to come along and listen to its story. The county had said the land was a liability. She proved it was a library. They saw only what it could not do, and she built a world from what it could. The hillside remembered. The land remembered.